I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may.
Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone and you're watching The Daily Question. Today's question of the day: what is hate speech and should we ban it? Now, the reason I'm asking that question is because I've gone to the viewer mailbag and I've received an email about this issue, or sort of related to this issue. But it's not just this email. A lot of people have contacted me on different platforms asking me about an incident that happened in New Zealand relating to free speech a couple of weeks ago, and asking what my thoughts were. And I thought it would be important to sort of unpack and talk about more than just the incident, and actually explore this question of freedom of expression and hate speech, and where the limits between the two lie. So here's this email from Richard. Hey Brendan, first of all I just wanted to say I love your videos. I'm in the UK and it's great waking up to a daily video each weekday morning, so keep up the good work. Thanks Richard, it's great to have you on board. I was hoping to find out what you thought about the recent no platforming of Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux on their trip to New Zealand, and also what you thought about the interview that they did on TV after the cancellation. Let me explain what happened for those who are outside of New Zealand and don't know about this incident. So Stefan Molyneux and Lauren Southern were booked to appear in New Zealand a couple of weeks ago, and the organisers had arranged for them to speak at a public venue that's owned by the local city council, the Auckland City Council. And then the Auckland City Council came out a couple of weeks before the event and said no, they are not going to be speaking here. Initially it was the mayor who claimed credit for it, and then it sort of became a bit murky about exactly who it was. Once people started threatening legal action, all of a sudden the mayor started suggesting that it wasn't simply his decision, there were more people involved, interestingly enough. But basically what they said was, these guys promote hate speech and it's not acceptable for them to use public venues as a presentation platform, so they're being banned from our venues. Then what happened was the organisers managed to contract into a business relationship with a private venue, and they had initially said they were happy to have them, and then literally within hours, I think it was 2 or 3 hours of the event kicking off that night, the venue owner freaked out and said, no, I don't want you using my venue. So this big debate then erupted about freedom of speech. That was followed on by another incident about a week or so later, but where one of our former almost prime ministers, it was a party leader of the main opposition party in New Zealand, was going to give a public speech at a university, and the Vice-Chancellor banned him from attending. And that's really sort of kicked off the furor even more. Which brings me to this sort of bigger question around hate speech rather than just the incident itself, because this incident and the subsequent incident with Don Brash, former leader of the National Party, is that basically it sparked a very public and very heated debate at times about what is hate speech, what is free speech, where are the limits of speech, are there limits on speech, all of those sort of big questions. Now, people in response have sort of justified the banning of Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux by saying, well, you know, this is hate speech and free speech is not absolute, and therefore it's okay to ban people or to prevent them from having platforms. You know, this is, you're free to say whatever you want, but you have to live with the consequences of that speech. I've seen people suggesting, and there's an article in the paper, I think it was last week, suggesting that basically freedom of speech is sort of constrained really to just sort of freedom of thought and the freedom to speak whatever you want to in private, but when you do it in public, that's a different story. Well, I would argue that's not true at all. In fact, I think that's very clearly mistaken. That's not why you need human rights. The reason you need human rights is because we live out the human experience in community, and what that means is in communities you have people who butt up against each other. You effectively have competing interests, and therefore there's a big question that arises: who gets the right of way? And when those sort of competing interests start to butt up against each other. And so the only reason you need the right to freedom of conscience or the right to freedom of expression is because you are going to live out the human experience in community. And that's where those rights actually come to bear. So to suggest that they are solely private things is an absolute nonsense as far as I'm concerned. But the big question here is, you know, what does this mean? What is freedom of speech all about? What is hate speech? Well, first of all, freedom of expression, as far as I'm concerned, and this is one of the really important principles, probably the first and most important principle to consider here, is that freedom of expression is not needed to protect popular speech. The reason you need this right is in order to protect unpopular speech or speech that sits outside the mainstream. That's the very reason why you need the right to freedom of expression. So you can say things that are not necessarily going to be popular to the people or during the time in which you say those things. So to suggest that we will only give people platforms if they say things that the majority find agreeable, clearly isn't even meeting that very first and important litmus test of what the right to freedom of expression is supposed to be all about. Secondly, on the question of is freedom of expression absolute, well, I guess there's a moral question and a legal question tied up with this, and it will depend legally. Different jurisdictions will have responded differently to that. But basically, in a nutshell, yes, freedom of speech, technically speaking, it isn't absolute. You can't say whatever you want to and then say, oh, I was just expressing myself freely. You know, you can't be pulled over by a police officer and tell a lie. So lying would be something that's not, covered. So you do something fraudulent, like you sign a document with someone else's name, or you are pulled over by a police officer and you give a false name. You can't then turn around and say, well, I was just expressing myself. I shouldn't be held accountable for that, and you're imposing on my free speech. So obviously there are limits. You can't incite people publicly with your speech to commit criminal acts. Let's go on a race riot and kill all the white people. That would be clearly something that you could be held accountable for. However, the limits of free speech are pretty broad, and rightly so they have to be, in order to ensure that you are not limiting legitimate forms of expression. And one of the issues here is that in order to ensure that there is a space for legitimate forms of expression and to meet that basic criteria that free speech exists in order to protect unpopular speech, that means that sometimes people are going to say things that are unpopular because those people are wrong or because they're just idiots. But you've actually got to allow and tolerate the idiocy and the wrongness in order to ensure that you don't violate or suppress things that are true and which are good, and things that need to be said and need to be heard. Secondly, on the question of hate speech, what is hate speech? Well, I don't think hate speech has an objective enough definition to be a legitimately used term, certainly not in law, because it's just so amorphous and subjective and without boundary. Talk to different people, you get a different answer for this question, what is hate speech? My belief is that when we talk about freedom of expression, we shouldn't be using the term hate speech at all. We should be using the term banned speech. So what are the things, the words, the type of speech that you think should be banned? That's what we should be talking about. So we're very clear about what it is we're talking about. Hate speech is a very emotive term that effectively for a lot of people, I think it becomes a very convenient way of not actually having to engage with the opposition and the arguments they're making. It's very easy to say, oh, that's hate speech, and we banned them because that was hate speech. And everyone else listening goes, oh, yeah, it's bad to be hateful, so yeah, we should suppress hate. That's not a good thing at all. But the problem is no one's actually bothered to clarify whether or not what they were saying was actually genuine hate, or whether or not what they were saying was simply disagreeable, or was simply something that was unpopular. And hate speech, I think, is very dangerous in that way. So I think you should actually be talking about banned speech. So it's really clear what you're wanting us to do here, to ban certain types of speech. And then in order for sort of this criteria to be met, what speech should be banned or not banned, I think you should have to answer a couple of important questions. Number one, you should have to show how leaving that particular speech that you want banned, how leaving it unbanned, so people are free to speak it publicly, how leaving it unbanned will actually cause greater harm to people, or will cause consequential harm to people. Now, I don't just mean that their intellectual or emotional equilibrium was upset, because that is not a consequential harm. If you hear something that makes you uncomfortable, or you hear something that challenges your awareness, or you hear something that even hurts your feelings, that is not a consequential harm, I would argue. It was certainly not consequential enough to talk about banning people's, or using that as a criteria in order to ban speech. Secondly, you should have to show how banning that particular type of speech will not lead to greater harm than leaving it unbanned. So first of all, you have to show how it's necessary to ban it because it causes genuine consequential harms. And secondly, how banning that particular speech will not actually result in greater harms. And if you can't prove your point on those two important issues, then you shouldn't be banning the speech, which is why we shouldn't be talking about hate speech. Like I said, it just becomes this very easy way of cloaking over political disagreement. Oh, that's hate speech. They're saying things that I disagree with about an issue that I'm passionately committed to. That's hate speech. This is the victim mentality that so often pervades culture now. And being a victim and claiming victimization is much easier than actually standing your ground and trying to defend your position and refute the position of another. So that's why a lot of people do it today. It's very easy. I'm a victim, stop that person from victimizing me. It's much easier to actually to deal with someone you disagree with by doing that to them than it is to actually engage with the point of disagreement. And we are losing sight of the ability to engage in a reasoned and free and open dialogue and discourse with others as a result. Now, what this means is that freedom of speech and the right to freedom of expression in the public space, because it's not there to protect popular speech, but it's there to protect unpopular speech, or the space for unpopular speech, what that means is, like I said, is you are going to have idiots. You are going to have people who say false things. But as the old saying goes, the best disinfectant is sunlight. And I think it was Barack Obama who said this recently in a speech, that when you've got people who are saying things, who are speaking in ways that are not good, the answer is not to suppress speech. The answer is to have more speech and to actually expose this thing to the light and to really pull it to bits and to counter it with the truth. That's what should be happening, right? That's how we should be responding to those issues, not resorting to a totalitarian impulse where we set up a system that effectively is suppressing people's right to actually speak freely when that right should be respected. Now, this is kind of like having a jury trial, and the principle of any sort of criminal trial, where the principle of natural justice is that you have to find a person guilty beyond a reasonable doubt before they're punished. Now, what that principle means is that there are going to be people who are genuinely guilty of crimes who manage to walk free because we can't prove it, or we don't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. As the old maxim goes, it's better that 10 guilty men go free than one innocent man go to jail or hang for a crime that he did not commit. And so that principle is really, really important. But in order to protect that principle and to ensure that natural justice is being upheld in the best and the most safest way possible, that means that you've actually got to allow for things that are messy around the fringes, for things that you don't necessarily want to happen. The same sort of principle applies, I think, when it comes to freedom of expression. What that means is you've got to allow that space in order to ensure that when that one person steps up, so you've got 10 people who promote lies or bad or ugly ideas, but when that one person steps up and says that one really important thing, they tell the truth, they say that good thing that needs to be heard right now, even though it's very unpopular, they have the space to do that they are not punished, that they are not dominated and brutalized simply for speaking their mind. And as far as I'm concerned, this idea that somehow you can use the cloak of hate speech and that it's acceptable to simply ban people from public spaces if they don't say things that are popular or mainstream, that is a very, very troubling, and not just troubling, but a very, very dangerous precedent that we've set. Effectively, not only have you handed a power to authorities that they should never wield, you have handed a power to certain ideologies that they should never ever wield. Those ideologies should never ever be free from legitimate forms of criticism, from legitimate forms of critique, and from scrutiny, because that's not how you go deeper into the truth. That's not how you become a more just and good society, by limiting inquiry. That's the exact opposite of how you end up, ending up with a good and stable and healthy functioning society. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comments section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please support me on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. There's a link in the description below and a link on screen at the end of this video. That's right, I can hear my theme music too. I'll see you next week on The Daily Question.